and how, if I walk around. So if I walk around, it'll still work?
Yeah, just sort of.
Okay.
We're about halfway up the aisle.
Oh, thank you.
Sit down for a second.
Let me go over here. Go ahead, just sit over here. Put me over here now. Sit here. I'll just sit here and wait. Yeah.
DeMond.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the final medical education grand rounds of this particular season. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. Dr. DeMond Miller is a professor of sociology and director of the Liberal Arts and Sciences Institute for Research and Community Service at Rowan University. He has worked as principal investigator to facilitate research projects involving natural and human-induced disasters, environmental issues, and community satisfaction. He is also a clinical substance abuse counselor and applied sociologist. His primary area of study is environmental sociology, disaster studies, and the study of the social construction of place, community development and community organizing, also social impact assessment. His principal areas of teaching are environmental sociology, medical sociology, clinical sociology, and applied community development. He's a member of the Medical School Board of CMSRU, and his presentation today will be on social determinants of survival and recovery from Hurricane Katrina. Our first speaker today is Les Hirsch. Many of you may know him. He's had a 35-year history in healthcare administration. And his career spans many institutions, many job functions. Importantly, he served as president and CEO of a number of institutions, including the Cooper Health System. He began here in 1988 as executive vice president and chief operating officer, and then became president and CEO in 1999. So many of us know and hold Les in high regard from that time. He's also served as president and CEO of St. Clair's Health System in Denville, at St. Joseph's in Denver, Colorado, and importantly at the Toro Infirmary in New Orleans. He started there in August of 2005, just 1 week before the devastating impact of Hurricane Katrina. So imagine being the CEO for 1 week and suddenly this happens. He's served on many boards of trustees, including the Ronald McDonald House of Southern New Jersey, the Camden County chapter of the American Red Cross, the Camden County Council of the Boy Scouts of America, and has been honored by multiple institutions, including the American Heart Association. He's been a community leader throughout his career, giving back to the community, and has been the recipient of numerous awards and recognition. He's a fellow of the American College of Healthcare Executives and is just coming off a 2 consecutive year term as chairman of the board of the New Jersey Hospital Association. He's also a member of the American Hospital Association Regional Policy Board for New Jersey. His bachelor's degree is in political science from William Patterson and a Master of Public Health from Fairleigh Dickinson. He's currently interim CEO and president of St. Peter's Healthcare System in New Brunswick. So please join me in welcoming both Mr. Leslie Hirsch and Dr. DeMond Miller.
Thank you, Dr. Raboli. Can everybody hear me okay? Got a lavalier on, so I'm going to wander around. It's really wonderful to be back here today. I feel like I've come home, but also feel like I've been away for a long time, and the house has had a lot of additions put on it. So it's really just extraordinary to see what's become of Cooper, and there's always a warm spot in my heart for Cooper. Hopefully you can see that. So as Dr. Roboli said, I've had some travel since I left Cooper in 2002. And today what I'm going to share with you is part of a story. I became CEO of Touro Infirmary in New Orleans on August 22nd of 2005, just 7 days before Hurricane Katrina came in. And today what I'd like to share with you is a part of that story. Usually when I tell this story, it also involves the recovery period and everything that was involved, but we're going to take it up today through the evacuation and try to give you a sense. What I would ask you to do is try to imagine what it might be like to be in this building in the heat of the summer with no air conditioning, oppressive heat, and with no phones, no power, just about, or limited power, and how you would deal with moving out almost 250 patients in those conditions. As doctors, as nurses, how would you have dealt with that? And that's what I would ask you to give some thought here as we get started. And my background, I'm not an expert in hurricanes, but it seems like after Katrina, when I came back to New Jersey, I also had experience with Sandy and with Irene. And so fortunately, so far up at St. Peter's, there hasn't been any bad weather, which I'm really grateful for. But again, I'm a healthcare executive. I've been at it a long time. And the thing that I would ask you, when you think about this, is how would you function in a situation that was totally unexpected, totally where you're unprepared for the specifics of it, and how are you going to get through it? And that's part of my story in terms of just, as a leader, how I dealt with that. So Katrina facts, just a couple things, and I know I've got to move pretty quickly here, but Katrina still, not that it's a contest, it was the most devastating natural disaster that we've ever had. If you can picture a federal disaster area covering 90,000 square miles, if you can picture looking outside and everything being underwater for as far as the eye can see in many parts of the city, the number of confirmed deaths, missing, the destruction, just a massive, massive storm. Where I was, literally, it was very real. I remember the night a housekeeper came in my office and sat down and talked, and she told me the story of how she lost her husband and the last time she talked to him and how he couldn't get out. Touro Infirmary is a hospital that goes back many years in New Orleans. It's a hospital of Jewish heritage. There's a whole story there. If you Google a man by the name of Judah Touro, that was how Touro Infirmary came on board. Nothing to do with the Touro Medical School, Touro University. Honestly, I don't know how they got that name, but only had been closed one other time in the history of this institution that goes back to 1852, and that was during the Civil War, which is pretty amazing. And again, if you're familiar with New Orleans and you know St. Charles Avenue up in the Garden District, if you've ever been to Commander's Palace on Britannia, it's a couple of blocks up the street from there. So I started there on the 22nd of August. Like any other job, you start a new job, the first thing you want to do is get out, meet people, get familiar. Last thing you want to do is sit in your office. And what we didn't know then, by Tuesday, this tropical depression had formed. And we weren't even thinking about a hurricane. This came up on us so quickly, there was very little time to prepare. So this tropical depression formed in the Bahamas. By Wednesday, it was a tropical storm. It was heading toward South Florida, actually crossed over Florida as a Category 1 hurricane at Aventura Beach, and literally went across the state. And by Thursday now, it strengthens to a Category 1 hurricane and plops out in the Gulf of Mexico. So very quickly, this storm came upon us. It did not follow the normal course up through the corridor, through the Caribbean, and the way the storms normally come in. So it really, kind of caught us by surprise, and it was on Thursday that we really began to focus on it. By Friday, it had hit major status as a hurricane. And again, remember, I'm on the job now 4 days. And, so we're forming our teams were meeting and we're talking about, getting ready and what to do. And, Katrina's becoming a pretty massive storm already. By Saturday, this storm hits the loop current in the Gulf. And the Gulf, as warm as it is, there's also a current that runs through it. That's the loop current. It's the warmest water, runs very deep. And when that storm hit that loop current, it just exploded. And it doubled in size and quickly became a Category 4 hurricane. We activated our disaster plan. This is on Saturday now. That plan went into effect on that day. We were planning for it with the command center being set up on Sunday. And this was the headline on Sunday morning, Category 5 coming. It was really very grim to think if a Category 5 hit New Orleans, what that would be like. We're braced for this. Quote, essential personnel are reporting, locking down the campus, parking. It was really a very strong sense of anticipation at that point. One question that comes up, and I've had to answer this question actually under deposition, because it seems that lawsuits always come out of circumstances like this, to shelter in place or to evacuate. We never even had a chance to think about it, to be very frank about it. Things happen so quickly, and when I've been asked about, well, why didn't you evacuate? Well, we couldn't. There was no time, there weren't the resources, and frankly, knowing what I knew at the time, I never would have authorized a full evacuation of the hospital at that point. It was just something that couldn't be done. So there may be some questions about that you may have, but I can tell you, had I had the decision to make again, and again, not independently, but in consultation, we would have sheltered in place as we did. And I think, history shows that was the right decision. So the storm is coming in. It's Sunday night. We've got 250 patients on board, 1,700 or so employees, families, and pets, literally. In New Orleans, the culture with hurricanes was we shelter, hunker down, and, have a party that night, although it was kind of solemn at times. And then the next day go home. And the only thing in this case, little did people know, there wasn't going to be the going home part the next day. So there we are, we're in the command center, a sense of anticipation. This is about 5 p.m. on that Sunday evening, and we're getting ready, for this storm to come in. You could just, if you look at the faces, the faces and the pictures, you get a sense. So storm comes in Sunday evening, about 3 o'clock in the morning it hits. We lose power about 3 o'clock. And you've heard that saying, batten down the hatches and the floodgates. Well, literally down there you have floodgates because there is flash flooding right around the hospital. So we did that, and the storm made landfall in the morning. If you've never felt the force of a hurricane, I was able to feel that because I went out into our parking structure, the garage during it, and it's like a freight train coming through. The winds are just pretty massive. And we were just at that point a Category 3. So this just gives you an idea of, I actually took these pictures as I walked outside in the garage just to get a sense of how it felt. But you can just get a quick look at what's going on. So we actually did pretty good. The storm came in, it passed, and did New Orleans dodge a bullet again. And the sun came out literally about 1 o'clock that day. It was Monday afternoon. We escaped major flooding, and there was flash flooding, and we started to do an initial assessment of the damage. And I guess hope is not a strategy, but you always have to prepare for the worst, even though we had little time to prepare, because things can change very quickly. And for us, they changed very, very quickly, because literally the next morning, on Tuesday morning, we received word that the levees were breaking. And it was amazing to see, talk about the social part of this, it was amazing to see how quickly people's demeanor began to change. Staff, people living up around the lake and hearing reports of the levees breaking, the water's coming, and people already thinking, my God, I'm going to lose my house. In fact, we moved our command center upstairs. We thought we might have 10 feet of water down there. A little hard for me to process, not having gone through this in the first week, but things changed very quickly for us. Now our emergency generators begin to fail. We're literally about 24 hours into this, and we had gotten a load of fuel that morning from, my recollection was, a military source, an unmarked tanker. And lo and behold, after that tanker comes in, and about literally within a couple of hours, the generator started to go on the, started to malfunction. And that's where, so quickly, literally in the course of hours, where we thought we dodged this bullet, that things are beginning to change. And now we're beginning to hear reports of things going on in the city. And there was a lot of social and suffering. People suffered there. But the fact is, there was also some other things going on in terms of upset and some of the other things in terms of that went on in the city there. But it was very clear that morning to me that things had changed remarkably, and we were heading into something that it was really uncharted waters for all of us. This gives you an idea of what it looks like when a levee breaks. If I hope I pushed the right button. So this is a levee. This is land that's not supposed to have water on it. This is a barge that should have been out here. So you get a sense of just, the power of what's going on. You've now got a city underwater. And so by Tuesday, literally, all so fast, it was very clear that we were losing these generators. The building, we were really losing the building. It was like being on a ship and the ship's going down. We're taking on water, so to speak. And this feeling of, how are we going to deal with this? Patient safety is definitely threatened. We're at a high risk of loss. I remember being in the ICU when all the lights went out, and immediately, the team sprung into action, bagging patients. No internal, external communications, very limited. No cable TV, no cell phones. We basically had one telephone line that we were able to get set up in analog, and the only way I found out the number of that was one night I called home. My daughter is here, Erica, who's a registered dietitian here. So there's still a Hirsch at Cooper, which I'm thankful for. And I remember calling home that night and said, what's the number here? Because I didn't even know the number. And there was a loss of city water supply for the first time during a hurricane. You cannot run a building without water, because that's the lifeline for the chilling, the chillers, and the system. So it was very clear that day in the morning, and this was literally in the morning, I can remember a meeting where people are asking, when are we going to get out of here? I can remember saying, folks, we're 30 hours into this, and we don't have a plan yet, but we'll figure it out. Our first responsibility is to our patients. But some of the dynamics, talk about social dynamics, you have spouses that are in the building that came to shelter that are now saying to their spouse that works for Toro, we got to get out of here. There was this panic that was beginning to set in people, even with the staff. So we needed a massive effort to evacuate. And again, it was a very eerie feeling because there wasn't any contact. There was nobody on the other end of the line on the HERE radio. There was no contact with any government agencies, National Guard or FEMA. And there's no doubt about it, as bad as people suffered, the conditions in the city were deteriorating, and there was definitely a great worry about safety at that point. And as I said, the conditions in the building just became, you could feel the heat. It was just oppressive in terms of the conditions, let alone for the patients that are in beds. You can imagine the impact for them. And as I said, fear begins to set in, and you lose hope, and it's a moment of truth. I have to tell you that as a leader that had been in the field for many years, and as a physician, many of you as physicians are in training. A doctor asked me one day, what prepared you for that? And I said, well, you're a surgeon, you've been at it about 30 years. If you were in somebody's belly and you saw something that you never saw before, you think you'd figure it out. And he said, of course. I said, well, that's basically how I operate. You have to draw on your instincts and your experience, you have to figure it out. But I will tell you, I had my own moment of truth in terms of I'm here a few days, and either you lead now or you never lead. And I literally processed that and decided as a leader that with that team, I was taking command of that team, and whether it was 5 days or 5 years, and we were going to get through this. But it was, you have a moment of truth from time to time. I'm sure many of you can understand that. Nothing more important in a situation than leadership, communication, and cooperation. There wasn't a lot of that going on. These are pictures from after the storm, and if you followed it, there was a lot of acrimony going on in terms of the president, the mayor, the governor. Looks like the mayor and I got the message about the same shirt. I don't know how that happened, but I'm only glad he's the one who ended up going to jail later on, not me. But that's Mayor Ray Nagin, obviously President Bush, and Governor Kathleen Blanco. But, you know, things were a mess during, in advance of, and after, and it was all because communication broke down and through the lack of preparation, even though this event was unprecedented. For me, it was very helpful to have the president of the Louisiana Hospital Association, who I only knew because of, as an applicant for the job, and going through my due diligence, I was able to connect with him and basically asked him the question of, how would a guy from the New York metropolitan area do in New Orleans? And that's how we got acquainted. But thank God I had connected with him, because he became my only link to the outside world with that one phone line. And it was because of him that we were able to arrange an evacuation that was not government supported. This was later on after we cleaned up. That was really not government supported. It was done by probably what is the first or second largest ambulance company privately held in the country that helped us out with this. This is a scene in my office. Just turned out that one phone line was a red phone that my predecessor had, so I said put the phone line on that. But what we were doing is planning an old-fashioned evacuation. No help from anybody, calling around the region for help, you know, to see where we might send patients. On Wednesday the 31st, we began an evacuation in the morning. We did get some supplies that were dropped in, which was helpful, but we began this evacuation. And this scene in this room, you could see all the patients' names on the board. We started to go through with physicians and others, started to go through a process of triage. You know, who's getting out? You know, you go into a military basis of triage in terms of who has the best chance of surviving, not necessarily who is the sickest. And you could see all the names on the board, and this is some of the planning that was going on. The fellow standing next to me, you can see we look a lot different now than we did Sunday night, you know, with the conditions that have set in. The fellow next to me was the flight commander for Acadian Ambulance, and he was here to support us to bring the helicopters in. And now we're planning this evacuation on Wednesday. We decided that the first people that are getting out are the little babies. Imagine being a parent and you have a baby at the hospital. And so we got 13 NICU babies out and you know, shipped them out. Some of them went to north in Louisiana, and then I guess that's where they all went. And then from there, they ended up being shipped to Houston, many of them. We had no idea where they were. We didn't have electronic medical records. We sent records with them. It was very hard then to tell where people went. But you can get a sense here of, you know, of just what was going on, you know, that day up on that deck, you know, getting the patients out. Look, you have to always look out for wild cards. Things are going well. You never know what's going to happen. And for us, later on that day, things turned. If you remember anything about Katrina, there was a lot of rooftop rescues going on. The city had flooded. All of the air support got diverted. So what we did is we made a decision. Because the evacuation was moving so fast and we couldn't keep up with it, and this is the decision that certainly I don't take full credit for it because it was a team effort, but ultimately, you know, I said yes. We moved all the patients across the street to the deck because we couldn't keep up with the evacuation. The fact then that the evacuation pretty much came to a halt is probably what saved most, you know, all of these lives, with the exception of I think we lost 9 people, 7 that were very, very sick that were in an LTAC, long-term acute care facility that was a licensed facility with ours. We lost 2 of our own patients. But unlike what you read in the story of 5 Days at Memorial, where some 40 patients died, there were claims of literally, you know, were patients euthanized. The doctor and nurses were arrested. They were never convicted. We moved them all over here, and as much as that looks like a mess in terms of it, it actually worked out very well. We kept people overnight because the evacuation had halted with little exception. But you get a sense of just a little bit of this suffering that went on. We were able to get about 15 patients out that night, and these are doctors, 2 doctors that you know, are rushing a patient to the helicopter. Actually, the reason why this picture looks so light is because of the flash. It was actually very dimly lit up there. But you could just see, if you look at the expression on people's faces, and they're pretty worn out, you know, you get a sense of what it was like to be there and provide care. So we got through the night, and on Thursday, I say Fort Toro armed and ready because of what was going on in the city and the concerns about violence, we literally were worried about our own security. And that morning, the fire commissioner come in, said, you've got to be out of here in about a couple of hours, and said, there's no way we're going to be out of here. And actually threatened me that, we may have to leave patients behind. And I said, then you relieve me of my responsibilities and you can take over, because he had that ability to do that. So because we won't leave until every last patient is gone. And it turns out that we didn't get everybody out till 1 o'clock. But before it was done, we had an armed perimeter around our building of a combination of police and firemen, and they came to protect Turo. And that's the news that I said with the bad news that I got from the fire commissioner that day. And then, somehow or other, the cavalry, I call it, arrived. And what I mean by that is just that there was this sudden onslaught of helicopters and just this intense couple of hours, more so than I've ever experienced in my life. And through the grace of God and the support of many people, we were able to, under some very difficult circumstances, completed an evacuation and got out of there about 1 o'clock. This is a scene in the back of the hospital. We're lining up caravans. You could see that there's a fella sitting on top of, or standing on top of what was a failed temporary generator that, with an assault weapon. We had a SWAT team sent in to protect us from one of the parishes that the president of the medical staff, actually his father, sent down from, I think, Terrebonne Parish, yeah. So we were, again, you can't really, because there's no sound, I will tell you, this was one of the most intense moments of my life, being out here. With just deafening noise with helicopters and things going. You see another fellow standing behind us. This is just across the street. And thank God we completed finally an evacuation and we closed the hospital. It was my 11th day at Turo. And, again, we got everybody out. We lost some people. But all in all, I think that decision, if you think about providing care, that decision to get all the patients across the street probably saved a lot of lives, especially when you think about how then we lost the elevator. So, and what we realized that day, it says, retreat hell, we're just advancing in another direction, a quote from an unnamed U.S. Army general. Because even though we were happy to get out, what we realized very quickly thereafter is that this was the beginning of the next phase in terms of the getting ready, how are we going to interact with government, everything that has to be done to bring the hospital back on. We were the only hospital that operated, adult hospital, in New Orleans for 5.5 months. And 27 days later, we opened the hospital. And before you know it, we were up to 300 patients a day over 60 days in a very aberrant environment. So, we were closed, and the question was what to do. And, let me just get this remote right. What to do. And there we go. And what to do. And I'm going to end here because I know we've got to get our next speaker up. But I'll just share some of these thoughts with you about leadership. You've got to have courage. You've got to be tenacious, persevere. Relationships are going to matter. In a crisis situation, you've got to be calm. I know for me, my daughter would probably say, gee, Dad, I wish you could do that at home. But the worse things get, the calmer I get at work, The worse it gets, the calmer I get. As other people get excited around me, that's my focus becomes that much more intense. And it always takes a great team, but these are just some thoughts that I would, have you consider. There's a lot about leadership, but that's just a little bit. And at the end of the day, you just, as Winston Churchill said, just never, 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 ever give up. So anyway, that's our story here. And the question I would say to you, and those of you that are in training, the medical students, as you look to your career, are you ready? Are you ready for the unexpected? And what will you do? Because, when you have your own moment of truth, it's important to be ready. So I thank you, and we're ready to turn it over. So thanks very much. Here so I can see. Huh? Right there? No, right there. Here, just hold that.
Good morning, good morning.
Morning.
As we begin the second presentation, my goal is to engage the future physician leaders in, this one? Sorry about that. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. My goal is to engage future physician leaders in understanding the role of social determinants as they impact survival and recovery. In this brief presentation, it's my goal not to cram you with a series of statistics, but rather provide an overview of some of the general concepts. My name is DeMond Miller. I am a professor of sociology and emergency management at Rowan University. Rowan University, we just got a new, and I have to put a little plug in here, degree in emergency management. It is the only one in the state of New Jersey. It is a traditional degree in the subject area. Live images of uncollected corpses and families clinging to rooftops made vivid what decades of statistics could not. That being poor in America, and especially being poor and black in a poor southern state, is still hazardous to your health. This quote by Atkins and Moy, I've cited it so many times in my own work and in books and in lectures, that it really rings true to me. I am a Southerner. I was born in Slidell, Louisiana, and I'm going to guess, help me out here, maybe 15 miles outside of New Orleans?
About, yeah.
About 15, 20 miles outside the city of New Orleans. So my family, too, suffered and survived Hurricane Katrina. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, citizens of the United States from all over saw their fellow countrymen just clinging to, in some cases, life from a rooftop, and in other cases, they watched their family members as well as their fellow countrymen succumb to death, and in many cases, the poorest seem to be the most vulnerable to ill-crafted policies of the past that today spawn high levels of social distress, unemployment, rampant alienation, neglect of communities, and political isolation. My little brief abstract here. The presenter uses past research, field observations, and existing literature to analyze the extent to which pre-Katrina New Orleans risk factors such as gender, disability, age, minority status, and poverty, and how they influence recovery outcomes. Moreover, issues of social justice and inequity are addressed as part of the ongoing struggle to build, and I'm going to say rebuild, disaster-resistant public health infrastructures of the future. So the vulnerable, more vulnerable, and the most vulnerable. When the levees protecting New Orleans failed in 2005, approximately 80% of the entire city was flooded. So if you can imagine, go back, have this image in your head, if you can just imagine everything you know covered in water, the gas station, the grocery store, your place of worship, your mosque, your church, your temple, all of these places were essentially covered in water. The deaths attributed to Hurricane Katrina and the levee failures totaled at least 986 Louisiana residents, of which, and this number is in dispute from place to place. We have the total number a little bit later. The major causes of death included drowning, injury and trauma, and heart conditions. Nearly half of the victims were over the age of 74. So again, we're talking about issues of health, but we're also talking about issues of age. In this iconic image, I'm trying to press the little button here. Okay. In the image, the image of the lady, the image of the elderly woman wrapped in the American flag became the symbol of social distress in various populations. And this is just one symbol. We have the aging population, the very young population, the LGBTQ population, all those different groups. Displaced residents. The storm displaced more than 1 million individuals in the Gulf Coast region. And when I say region, I'm talking about Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Texas, as well as Florida. Population decreases. Essentially, the city of New Orleans lost, by most estimates, half, if not 60 to 70%, depending of the time of the storm. As of now, we're talking about approximately 12 years after Hurricane Katrina. The city has still not reached its pre-Katrina population. It is at about 80% of what it once was in 2000. This is the map of diaspora. So in the advent of all the changes taking place during the middle of the evacuation of Hurricane Katrina, individuals, essentially your low-income individuals, in many cases were given bus passes, plane tickets, rides, however they could get them out of the city of New Orleans. One of our congressional members in Congress from Louisiana was quoted by saying, in USA Today, I believe, Hurricane Katrina did something that we finally couldn't do. It cleaned out the projects. And so what he did was he essentially asserted the claim that Hurricane Katrina was one of the ways in which those who are poor, those who are destitute, many who were single mothers, were essentially dispersed throughout the country. Every state and territory in the United States received the unwanted, the throwaways, and the Katrina refugees, as they were called. I don't like to consider my family Katrina refugees. My family evacuated to Mississippi, parts of Alabama, Arkansas, and other parts of Louisiana and some parts of Texas. Katrina disrupted the lives of so many individuals that many of them have never returned. One of the research projects that I am currently engaged in actually involves traveling around various states to actually collect data on the reasons why people left, the reasons why people returned. Many of them argued they just don't want to go back. They don't want to go back to the same structure. Now, let me just pause here for a second. As a future physician leader, and as a researcher, and as a person that has emotional ties, as a person that has familial ties to the area, you know, we get tied to what we are doing. But while I'm doing my research, while I am talking, while I am engaging with individuals, I have to remember what it is I bring to the table. From a critical race perspective, as an educated African-American male with a PhD, I bring some of the, I want to say, the baggage that goes along with that. And as physicians we need to be careful with how we address preparedness and how we address various communities, because various communities evacuating as opposed to being considered the throwaway trash, never to return home, resonates, and it resonates deeply with many members leaving New Orleans. Housing damage. Now, some of these are my very own pictures. The house here with the inverted car is actually in the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans. It is about, I'm going to say, 300 or 400 feet away from the levee image that you saw. This is walking distance from the Red Barge. My grandmother's hallway. As a kid, I can remember playing in the hallway here. This is my grandmother's house. So the housing damage, Hurricane Katrina damaged more than 1 million housing units in the Gulf Coast region. Again, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, all included. So individuals didn't have anything to go home to. And what they went home to was in many cases toxic, was in many cases condemned, was in many cases poisonous to them. And so many of the individuals, especially our frail elderly, especially our immunocompromised individuals, simply could not return to their own home, their own place of residence. And it was ultimately condemned. Many places were ultimately condemned because no one came back. And that's one of the other issues. Many people just simply could not get back because of health reasons or family reasons, private reasons, as well as economic reasons. And for those that were able to come back, many of them were given FEMA trailers. Now, this is actually one of the major issues in terms of race, class, as well as gender in some respects. Many of the individuals returning to live, and this is the lower 9th Ward, they returned to live in the area. They were provided FEMA trailers. Keep in mind, this is where a garage used to be. You can see a little walk-in, you can see a little driveway where a house used to be. This gentleman here, one of the individuals that I've been interviewing and following in a longitudinal manner, he was given a FEMA trailer, but after he was given the FEMA trailer, studies were conducted of the air quality in the FEMA trailer, and the glue used to hold the FEMA trailer together was found to contain formaldehyde. And so the solution for many of these African Americans and low-income individuals was to give them ferns, because ferns will help purify the air. As many of them went into respiratory distress, as many of them simply could not stay in the home that was provided for them. Once they actually did get back into the city of New Orleans, many of them had a second evacuation out of New Orleans simply because they could not live in the toxic home. Again, imagine a place in New Orleans heat. How many of you have ever been to New Orleans? How many of you have ever been to New Orleans in August? Okay. So you can imagine a little tin trailer that's put together by glue that contains parts of formaldehyde and the fumes in this enclosed area, sleeping in this area as an asthmatic in an area that is full of toxic mold. So put all those things together and you can get the picture. Total damages in the over 135 billion, and the recovery funding was about 120, give or take, $1 billion in terms of the efforts. In comparison, you can look at the philanthropic giving, while more than double the giving for either the Indian Ocean tsunami or 9/11. Private insurance claims covered less than 30 billion of the losses. Most people simply did not have the private insurance claims. So just as, just to simply put by the numbers, you have over 1 million displaced, over 300,000 homes destroyed, 80% of New Orleans completely underwater. And keep in mind, New Orleans is a bowl. And so by virtue of you living in the city of New Orleans, you may be 1 foot below sea level or 30 feet below sea level at any given place, any given time. Some places 10, that's the average, 10 feet below sea level in some places. The single most catastrophic natural disaster in U.S. history, as we know as Hurricane Katrina. The health sector was completely disrupted across the continuum of care, from the first instance, the primary care, all the way into the 4th level of care. There was utter disruption. Most hospitals, facilities, including the academic medical centers, as well as nursing homes, were initially closed. Some of them remain closed to this very day. Many of them were relocated. We just heard the case example in terms of the relocation. However, there is one example that I would like to bring up, St. Rita's Nursing Home. St. Rita's Nursing Home is, I believe it will probably go down in the annals of medical ethics in terms of, is this an act of God? Is it negligent homicide or poor judgment? Essentially, 35 individuals, 35 frail elderly were left in their beds to die. Left in their beds to die. Now again, was it an act of God? Was it negligent homicide? Or was it simply poor judgment? on behalf of the administrators and the clinical team and the clinical leadership. Should you have evacuated? What did you know when you know? How did you use it? Knowing that your most frail elderly would die. Ultimately, the chief administrators, they were acquitted of all charges, but the facility has never reopened as such, and the community has never been the same. And those that did return from those places, that map that I showed you from around the country, those that did return found the social, economic, and political landscapes, they were just totally in disarray. Homes, schools, places of worship, the public facilities were almost destroyed or covered in mold. As a side note, as a sociologist, some of the most beautiful mold plumes I've ever seen were in New Orleans. No, I wouldn't walk into any of these houses and inhale the mold, but very interesting. The health services, public health, mental health services simply were not equipped, they were not adequate to even handle those individuals coming back. And the basics of a civil society were functioning on a rudimentary level at best in most parts of the city. So what we are having here are individuals that are coming back. Those that did come back tended to be a population that was more Hispanic. They were somewhat older. They had the means to get back, and they were more likely to be insured. Keep in mind, those that did come back had the means, and they began to get their lives. They began to have the characteristics, the social, the economic characteristics, the education, to begin rebuilding the city. Those who could not get back, they were not provided for. And in many cases, many of the housing developments were demolished. The Lafitte, the St. Bernard, these major housing complexes were utterly destroyed. So people who were returning had nowhere to go. They were not given a chance to remove anything. They were not given a chance to engage in any means of recovery other than stay where you were, be it Texas, be it wherever. The returning population was had a high burden of illness. There was pent-up demand for mental services, health services, mental illnesses in terms of depression were at clinical levels where the individuals simply could not, the demand was too high and they could not meet the demand, the public health sector and the mental health sector as it was emerging. What I always like to show is this picture. On several research trips and when I bring students for service learning trips, we are always engaged in communities. And we are always engaged with, for the most part, communities that are disadvantaged in some way. One day we were walking through the neighborhood and I asked the students to stop, and we took this image. And I always remind my students that we are not here to help communities rebuild. We are not here to pick up and clean up. We are not here just to get a service learning credit on our transcript. We are here because people live here. These little dolls, homework on the floor, pictures, wedding bands that were strewn all around where houses used to be represent communities. And as those of us who are leaders, be education leaders, academic leaders, physician leaders, we are always, always humbled by the fact that we are serving the public, we are in communities, and we are working to address the needs of those in the communities. And this is a reminder of that. So what does Katrina teach us? Atkins and Moy, I like them. They describe Hurricane Katrina as a teachable moment, an opportunity that clearly presents the impact of poverty and race on health, the social, historical, and political milieu that has contributed to health disparities is also the one in which disasters occur. And so we need to be cognizant. And so this whole notion of the social, the political, the historical context of medicine, of leadership, and being able to understand where we are and the positions we hold is critical in rebuilding healthcare infrastructures. So as I'm closing out, at the heart of strengthening the infrastructure of public health is funding prevention instead of rescue. And so we will go to my last little thing here. I argue from Katz argues, and I agree, a true rebirth of distressed areas and the cities in which they are located will only occur if we make these places neighborhoods of choice for individuals and families with a broad range of incomes and neighborhoods of connection that are fully linked to metropolitan opportunities. This was one of the fundamental issues in terms of recovery, in terms of the social dynamics. Individuals were cut off. Individuals of neighborhoods that did not afford opportunity, healthcare access, and essentially locked individuals in various places of non-opportunity. And so these are some of my students. We're down in New Orleans. We're actually rebuilding, not only dealing with some of the social issues, but dealing with some of the actual infrastructure issues where we adopted several families. In the top, you see one of the Rowan students actually engaged in working with a homeowner. This is our entire team working with a homeowner, her and her husband. And then this is a home where we stopped. A body was found in this home and was retrieved while our students were there. They actually stood on the sidelines and they saw that process take place. And the sources here that I use for this presentation. So it's a combination of my own research, trying to spark questions, trying to fuel the ideas that we engage in and what we bring to the table as leaders in the field. Thank you much, and have a good morning.
For questions?
So Mr. Hirsch and Dr. Miller will be here for at least another 5 minutes, perhaps longer, to answer any questions.
I think there's a question. Dr. Viner has a question.
I certainly sympathize and empathize with DeMond's point of view here about let's get it out of here. But I submit that the real breakdown in our federal government on being able to mobilize. I mean, how we mobilize to bomb Iraq, we mobilize to do countless other things. We have the helicopters, the other equipment that could have been saved. We had a president sitting on his ass in Washington, and Brownie, his buddy Brownie, congratulated with great fans.
Yeah.
Great job, Brownie. Where the hell were they, Russ?
Well, Dr. Viner's question is about the breakdown that occurred and, putting aside the social, I think, factors that Dr. Miller talked about that are symptomatic. In the episode of Katrina, they never were able to get the buses rolling. There were literally enough buses, school buses, that could have transported some 30,000 people out of the city. But the planning that didn't occur for that, is obvious, and those buses ended up underwater. Now, you could argue, there's no doubt about it, this storm came in quick, and literally within 48 hours, of it coming into the Gulf, 72 at the most, it was there and it was on us. So, but you could still argue, why wasn't there any mobilization? Instead of 30,000 people getting out by those buses, why not 10,000? And so it was a total breakdown. And then the government didn't come into New Orleans. You know, they waited until the storm passed, and then when it passed, there was the delay of between the governor and the president. It wasn't really the mayor at that point. Whatever was involved in the city, the breakdown with the, you know, whatever happened, why those buses didn't evacuate people anywhere. But after the fact, it was really the federal government. Thank God that finally, whatever the deal was that was made, General Honore, an African-American general, if you remember seeing him on TV, he came in and he saved the day. You know, I didn't get into all of what was involved in the aftermath, but I will tell you, in the aftermath of being there, you did have the feeling of there was action being taken and there was a descending on the city. In fact, it's a unique experience to be in an American city that was under military occupation, which was really a unique experience, a friendly occupation. But I'd say that this breakdown that occurred, you know, something else could have been done, but nothing happened. The buses, nothing, and 30,000 people ended up in a terrible situation in the Superdome, and they were angry, and they had every reason to be angry. And you see the pictures, some of the pictures.
And if I could just add just one little thing here, I mean, there is a history of neglect where our urban communities are zones of sacrifice. We essentially sacrifice many of our urban centers. Camden is one example. You go into Pittsburgh, you go into New Orleans. And so there is a history where there has been neglect from every aspect, from the school system to the critical infrastructure, all the way to the academic and educational infrastructure. So this is not a new thing. The true crisis is the breakdown. I mean, hurricanes will occur, tornadoes will occur. The true crisis is the breakdown.
I think Dr. Ross has a question up there.
Well, I would like to say things would be different. However, based on the rebuilding of the levees to the exact same specifications, other than these things have simply not been put in place, rudimentary measures in terms of community engagement, I would like to say that it wouldn't be as worse. However, we are repeating some of the same mistakes. We have learned some things, but we are repeating some of the exact same mistakes. We have plans, but of course plans mean nothing if they are not studied, rehearsed, and put in place. And we're starting to see some of the exact same patterns of excluding certain groups, especially the African American community, and we're seeing some of the elderly individuals. Their input is not being not being considered as vibrantly as it should be.
Do you have the sense, DeMond, that if this had been Hilton and South Carolina, that they'd have handled it better?
I don't want to come out and say that they would, but I believe you would have seen a more rapid response. You would have seen a quick response. Now, how the response would have been handled, I leave that to our friends in the federal government. But I believe that the needed supplies would have been there, the evacuations would have been there, the types of security would have been there. You would not have seen the extent of social erosion as we saw in New Orleans, as well as the rebuilding. There are certain parts of the city now 11 and some odd years, 11 and a half years, that have still not been rebuilt. And so, and I also believe that there would have been a rush to repopulate Hilton Head.
You see the difference in the response to Katrina, the federal response to Katrina, and the federal response
decks were built now on concrete bases. The previous sites were built with earth bases. When water gets to earth, it
This is
washes
true.
away. I mean, you can't, I mean, if you build a wall, actually, it's like a three-wheel pit. You build it out of sticks, the wall will blow it.
Sure.
You build it out of bricks, the wall will not blow it.
Yeah, I mean, the good news on the levees.
And this, yes, I stand corrected on that, yeah, but yes.
The good news on the levees is that,
In Louisiana, this goes way back to, it's a corrupt city. It was a continuation of corrupt. The mayor there, as Les said, the buses sat in the parking lot. And this was under his direction. So he was incompetent. So you get disaster and put incompetence ahead of it, and the water's coming in.
yeah, yeah.
I'd like to have the opportunity, actually, the time is over.
Yeah.
I don't know if Dr. Miller and Mr. Hirsch can stay.
Nice to meet you, nice to meet you.
But I'd like to thank them both for a very insightful grand rounds today. Something that, all of us should think about and see how we can work in our advocacy for patients and various groups, the underserved in particular. So I want to thank them both.
Thank you.